And as our friends at Zoom let us know, we are recording this. So everyone's going to start filtering in, but we're going to go ahead and get started with our third session for our Ecosystem Services and Carbon Markets virtual workshop series. And this is, again, number 3. It's August 23rd, 2021. We actually started this conversation back in 2020. Paul and I connected. We were going to be at an in-person event together and have this conversation, actually get out on the land. And then, of course, COVID came and we decided that it was really still important to have this conversation. So we switched it to a virtual gathering. And there was so much interest in it that we decided to continue the conversation this year. And our focus and our intention is to be of service to producers, land managers, pastoralists, the people who are on the land, who are to help everyone make sense of these emerging marketplaces. And there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of potential for greenwashing, and we want to hold the space for real conversation, for truth to come out, and for us to be able to navigate through this together and really get the results of our world in the direction that we want to go, and not just this be another program that benefits a few at the expense of many. So that's the intention of today. My friend Paul will host the conversation. My colleague Olivia and I will be here to support. So please, just a few housekeeping pieces before we jump in. If you could keep muted, that would be great so that we can really hear our amazing panelists and speakers today. If you have questions, we want to hear them, and we want your most candid, your biggest questions to come through. Please put them in the chat, and Olivia and I will watch for them, and we'll surface them to Paul and the panelists at the appropriate time. All right, Paul, well, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll hand it over to you to lead our conversation.
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to continue our webinar series. I'm Paul Zorner. I'm the Chief Agronomist for Locus Agricultural Solutions, which is a biological soil amendment company headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, although I live in California. And we do, as Abbey noted, we have some remarkable panelists today. Megan Machmuller from Colorado State, Will and Jenni Harris from their farm in Georgia, and then Sina McCullough, who is just a remarkable food author and activist. All three have some really remarkable perspectives that I think they can share with us today. But rather than me introduce them, I'm going to have them introduce themselves. And so, Megan, we'll start with you. If you could take a few minutes and tell us about yourself, who you are, and what you do, and where you're located.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Megan Machmuller, and I'm a research scientist at Colorado State University. Much of my research focuses on soil carbon sequestration and soil health in our managed lands, but also understanding the impacts of climate change on our ecosystems in general. How can we create resilient and sustainable ecosystems, sustainable for the world, but also the people in which thrive and live off of them. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm excited to engage in this conversation, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you, Megan. So Will and Jenni, could you each introduce yourselves?
Good. I'm Will Harris. White Oak Pastures is our family farm in Georgia. Jenni's children of the 6th generation of our family own that farm.
Wow.
We pasture raise chickens, turkeys, geese, guineas, ducks, cows, hogs, sheep, goats, rabbits. We hand butcher them in the USDA inspected slaughter plant we built on the farm. Raise pastured eggs and honey and organic vegetables and a number of other ancillary businesses that the bounty gives us. Okay.
Hey, I'm Jenni Harris. I'm one of Will's daughters, and I'm the director of marketing for White Oak Pastures. So we like to think about our farm as having 3 stools in the vertical integration. There's production, processing, and sales. And that sales leg of the stool is mine. So it's great to be with y'all.
Awesome, thank you. So Sina, could you introduce yourself, what you do, and where you're located?
Sure. So I'm Sina McCullough. I live in Virginia. And I'm really excited to be here. I've never been on a panel before discussing carbon markets and the like, so this is new for me. I actually got into this area because of health issues. So I have a PhD in nutritional science from UC Davis and a bachelor's in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior. But I think the most interesting thing about my story is that in spite of supposedly being an expert in food, I nearly died from an autoimmune disease, largely because I didn't understand what's really in our food and how it's grown. Fortunately, I was able to turn it around. I'm fully healed, fully recovered, not in remission. I am fully healed. It's been 6 years now. And that was largely because I educated myself about what's really in the food. And I learned how to reverse disease, actually by reading and listening to a lot of information that's censored today. But that's now what I do is I spend my time. My first priority is to homeschool my children. And secondly, I consult and teach people how to reverse their own condition to help them find their second chance at life too.
That's awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, we are going to start the conversation, and I have no idea of what direction this ultimately is going to take, because all three of you represent, such different attributes, but it's all connected. And I think that's the theme of the discussion today is, look, a lot of things we have to pay attention to, but in the end, this is an ecological system. I'm actually a systems ecologist by training. And we have to pay attention to everything in order to ultimately achieve our goal, which is to take care of this beautiful blue globe, that we sail around on, and create some, sustainability in terms of our ability to produce food, but also to preserve the land and the resources that are essential for us to be able to take care of ourselves, the organisms that we share this world with, and have the land in a condition 1,000 years from now as it is, as it was 1,000 years ago. So we're going to start with Megan. Megan, I've told you before, I think you've done some really remarkable research on carbon accumulation in soil, and today is about carbon, but not just about carbon. So could you talk a little bit about carbon accumulation in soil, but also what that leads to? How does carbon accumulation in soil relate to the water cycle, to the nutrient cycle, to the microbiome cycle? And maybe touch on that. And then at the same time, and I realize there's two questions in this, is there a limit on how much carbon you can put in soil? You often see from people, you can only put so much carbon in soil, and maybe depending upon mineral content and things like that, that's true. But if you could address that, but really talk about carbon as maybe the centerpiece of stimulating and sustaining all the other cycles that are important to land management.
Well, you said it right there. It is really truly the centerpiece. And that's why, of course, that there's so much interest in rebuilding soil carbon in our agricultural soils, because we understand all of the benefits that come along with it. And it's the driver, it's the nexus of these interacting nutrient cycles, for example, and contribute substantially to soil health. But first off, why is soil carbon sequestration even being talked about? Why is it important? The first thing to realize is that there is an immense potential to regenerate our soils, to rebuild soil carbon stocks in our agricultural and managed lands. And why is that? Well, years and years of management removing biomass from our agricultural lands through harvest, we haven't replenished those soil carbon stocks over time. So as a result, we've lost 30 to 50% of our topsoil. So number one, that's a huge potential to rebuild what was once there before. And we can do that, and we know we can do that through management practices. And what sort of management practices might lead to, rebuilding your soil carbon stocks? Well, that is highly dependent upon where you live and your climate, what you're growing, and the potential that exists, how much carbon has lost before, and also, the soil type. So there's a lot of interacting factors that can contribute to both the rate of soil carbon accumulation and the total amount that can be sequestered. And so when we think about the carbon cycle, we can really think about it quite simply as, in order to build soil carbon stocks, one of two things have to happen. Either you increase the amount of inputs to the soil, or you decrease the amount that's leaving the soil. So, increasing the amount of carbon in the soil comes from plants. Photosynthesis is the driver here. So keeping plants in the ground year round, for example, and increasing those inputs into the soil will help. That's the first thing that needs to happen in order to start rebuilding your soil carbon. And like I said, secondly, reducing the rate of CO2 loss via decomposition. So the microbes in the soil utilize that carbon as an energy source and transform it, either use it to grow and build their bodies and thrive in the soil and contribute to many functions that the plants rely on and we rely on. Microbial biodiversity in the soil is important for soil health, for plant health as well. And so, but as a result of these microbial processes in the soil, they either use the carbon to build their biomass and they also respire it through these processes. When they respire carbon, that leaves the soil as CO2. So we're either reducing the rate at which it's lost, but that means that we have to influence the microbial activity. So there's kind of a conundrum here. Healthy soil is an active soil. We need microbial activity to maintain that cycling of nutrients that are then available to the plants to grow and thrive. And so most would argue that the most effective way to build soil carbon is to increase the rate and the amount of carbon coming into the soil. So we can maintain a healthy, thriving, and active microbial community, but it needs to come from somewhere. So increasing the rate at which carbon is coming into the soil by maintaining that productivity is probably the most effective way. So I could go, this could be several different classes, but I'll try to keep it short. So I mentioned that there's limitations to both the rate and the total amount of carbon that can be sequestered in your soil. And there's, I said climate, soil type. There's many factors that influence, the potential. But we also have to realize that the rate of soil carbon accumulation is not constant throughout time. It's not linear. It can start to accumulate or attenuate throughout time. We also have to realize that because we have an active microbial community and the carbon is always cycling, that it is not necessary. It's not, the carbon that's sequestered is not permanent, but what matters is how long it will be retained in the soil. That fact right there will determine its potential at actually mitigating climate change. We can go into more details as we can continue on the conversation, but let's start there. Did I answer the questions?
Yeah, no, well, you gave a lot of very useful information. I mean, it is, carbon is so important in so many aspects, and certainly the microbial food source, if you will. Right. And maybe one thing you could comment on, then I'm going to ask Will and Jenni to comment, because I know they have an opinion as well on this. But before we started the webinar here, we were talking briefly about all the rain in Georgia and the amount of water holding capacity that soil carbon adds to things. Could you talk about carbon as it relates to soil aggregates and aeration, and the ability of soil to absorb water and have more moisture holding capacity?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, building soil carbon, not only for its climate mitigation potential, but also carbon is contained in soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is approximately 50% carbon. but also contained in that soil organic matter is all other essential nutrients like nitrogen. As we build soil organic matter in our soils, we know that that there's so many co-benefits that come along with it, such as enhanced cation exchange capacity, influencing the way that nutrients flow and the efficiency at which they are transformed in the soil. Secondly, most importantly, especially out here in the West, water is a huge issue. So if we can maintain or retain water in the soil for longer periods of time, that's a huge win, especially in water limiting systems. So carbon plays a huge role in maintaining or retaining water in the soil. So it enhances the water holding capacity. And so indeed, it plays a critical role in maintaining soil health, as an important aspect of that is water retention.
Awesome, great. So, Will, I know you have some thoughts on soil carbon and other things that are associated with that. Do you want to comment on what we're talking about here as well?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Megan said. I voiced to you earlier that I fear that we're talking about carbon alone too much. The cycles of nature are, again, we've already talked about them, the mineral cycle, the microbial cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, grazing cycle, on and on. And for nature to yield the abundance, all those cycles have to be operating properly. And what brought me to this space is that I was a very, very industrial farmer 25 years ago. Used a lot of chemical fertilizer, a lot of pesticides, a lot of tillage on the land, on the animals, a lot of subtherapeutic antibiotics, a lot of wormers, a lot of outside inputs on them, and realized I was breaking the cycles of nature, and I didn't like the way it looked. So if you're doing something you don't like, first thing you need to do is stop doing that and start doing something else. So that's what we did.
Yeah. Sina, do you want to make a comment to any of this, or do you want to wait until we start talking about soil health and human health relationships?
Sure. Yeah, I'll wait for the human health part because that's really my expertise.
All right, great. All right, so Will and Jenni, you as you just mentioned, Will, you did industrial farming for a long time. You didn't like what you saw, so you decided to do something different. We don't quite how to pose this to you, but where did you start and where are you on now? What benefits have you seen? Not just in terms of soil health, but economically. I mean, and what ups and downs? I think I recollect reading an article from you saying, look, it hasn't been a steady journey. There's been a lot of ups and downs associated with the economic aspects of your farm. But could you walk us through that a little bit?
Well, you can bet that 25 years ago, a 40-year-old Will Harris didn't walk outside and say, I believe what I'm doing is contributing to climate change, and I believe I can help mitigate it by changing. That's not the way that happened. What happened was I didn't like the way the land and the animals were responding to that management system that I had taken over from my father and honed at the University of Georgia and come back and implemented for 20 years. I just became increasingly dissatisfied with the unintended consequences of that farming model. So I started changing them. And again, the first step for change is to give up the things that are causing a displeasing result, like tillage and chemical fertilizer and pesticide. And I think that the cycles of nature would eventually heal themselves if all you did was give up those tools, especially with animal impact involved. But it would be a very slow process. And I do this for a living. and I needed the process to be done more quickly. So we set about the business of figuring out how to use animal impact to bring the cycles of nature back up and running properly.
Yeah, awesome. So that kind of leads us. You mentioned you didn't like the way the land was responding, or the degradation of land, the health of your animals, the health of your crops. So, Sina, that kind of brings things around to you. You know, crops do have an immune system. I know you're an expert in immune systems and human immune systems, but I've always felt that, you know, the food we eat certainly contains a lot of microbes. Microbes, the human gut is very important in terms of the immune system. At Locus, as I mentioned earlier, we make a soil amendment. We call it a soil probiotic. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences, your own personal situation, what you found about the food that you were eating that caused your severe health consequences, and what you did or what you look for in order to mediate that and get yourself, or how anybody might get back on track in terms of the way they look at the food they eat, but also how that food is grown. I used to work for a private equity company where we say, don't worry, worry about the food you eat, but also worry about the food your food eats.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, all right. That big question there.
Yeah, I realize that. I'm sorry.
I'll try to hit on, some key points. Okay, so as I mentioned, I kind of stumbled into being what I'm referred to as like a food activist, champion of farmers now, which, like I said, I stumbled upon that. So I looked for over 20 years for answers for my many medical conditions that I had. And the first symptoms started in my early 20s. I mean, I'm now 45, which, by the way, at the age of 45, I'm so healthy that I just had a 9-pound baby girl, a totally healthy baby girl.
Congratulations.
So I mentioned that. Thanks. I mentioned that because you're going to sometimes hear her screaming in the background.
Okay, well, 9 pounds, that's quite a load. So congratulations on
Yes,
that.
but a testament to where you can come. I went from literally laying on the ground, almost dying, like too weak to sit up. Like every time I took a breath, my ribs hurt. I couldn't wrap my hand around a cup. At my rock bottom, my son, who was 6 at the time, he had to come hold a cup to my mouth with a straw in it just so I could take a drink of water. It was bad. We knew I was going to die if we didn't find another path. But to make my story short, what happened was I looked for over 20 years for answers in the Western medical system. Like that's how I was raised. That's all I knew. And nobody had any answers. I didn't check the boxes to fit into any one disease category. So I finally got to I had so many tests done, by the way, breath tests, urine tests, fecal tests. I had colonoscopies, sigmoidoscopies, even exploratory surgery. And none of the doctors could figure out what was wrong. The last doctor I saw was a specialist, GI specialist, who said the symptoms had to be in my head because they couldn't classify me as having any kind of disease. So at that point, I knew I was going to be on my own. If I was going to actually heal myself, I had to get out of that system. So I did. I broke away from that system, which was what I was raised on, and that's what I was trained in during my 10 years in college. So what I did was I started with our food supply because I knew that I was having problems with the food I was eating. And I started really digging in and researching what is actually in this food. Went to original source documents, the government's own documents of, how they regulate our food and what they allow in it. And do you want me to give you one example of something that I found? Paul?
Absolutely. Yes, I had to get myself off mute.
Okay. Okay. Just one example is grass, which is generally recognized as safe. That sounds good. And actually, when I was working in industry, I formulated supplements. And our big thing was, as long as something's grass, it will pass. Meaning, if the government's declared it to be grass, you can put it in the supplements. The same thing occurs in the food supply. There's grass chemicals all over the food supply. So what I found out was that there's about 10,000 chemicals that are added to our foods, 10,000. And the majority of them are added through what we call the GRAS loophole. So when something is designated as GRAS, what that means is the company who created that chemical deems it to be safe. They hire some expert, some scientific expert that's often bought and paid for by the company. And as soon as that expert decides, like declares that chemical to be safe, it is immediately allowed to be added to the food supply. They don't even have to notify the FDA that they're adding that chemical to the food. And actually, that process of notifying the FDA is voluntary. So, but what was really the big kicker for me, though, was guess who made that process, that voluntary process, a law? Like, guess who allowed it to be a voluntary process? The FDA. So not only does it mean these GRAS chemicals are not tested by the FDA, they're not regulated by the FDA, they're not even closely monitored by the FDA. And in fact, the FDA doesn't even know that many of these chemicals are in the food supply. So for me, the question was, well, I was raised to believe that the FDA protects our food along with the USDA, and they certainly tout that on their websites. But how can they actually ensure the safety of our food if they don't even know which chemicals are being put in the food? And many of these chemicals have been recalled, actually. That's another point. If any of those chemicals are recalled, the FDA can't notify you because they don't know that they're in the food. And we certainly don't know the quantity that's in the food. And we certainly don't know what happens when you combine one chemical from one food with another chemical from another food, because nobody tests that. Nobody tests that relationship. So this is quite alarming when you start looking at the types of chemicals that they have allowed to be on our food, in our food supply and on our dinner plates because of this GRAS loophole. So for instance, one example is GMOs. The FDA did not officially approve GMOs. They, quote, presumed GMOs to be GRAS. So in terms of FDA, quote unquote, approval of GMOs, they fell through that GRAS loophole. So that tells you where the safety of our food supply sits right now, you know? So that's just one example of,
Right.
Go ahead, Paul.
Could I ask you a specific question? So you're talking about things that are in our food that shouldn't be. How about things that aren't in our food that should be? And specifically, because I want to relate this to soil health and microbiology and probiotics, could you comment on gut health and how that relates to food?
Exactly. So this is the big way that I healed myself was, identifying not only food labels and how that leads us astray and picking other foods, but getting out of the grocery store and to my local farms, regeneratively, operated farms, because obviously it's critical to build a robust microbiome, both in your gastrointestinal tract and, on your skin throughout your body, in order to heal yourself and in order to achieve optimal health and wellness, right? That's, front and center right now in this pandemic, right? This is the critical component to healing yourself and staying healthy. So what I realized on my journey is that it's really difficult to fully heal yourself if you are containing yourself to the grocery store. And that's because nearly all the food in the grocery store is sterilized in some way or another, meaning it is lacking a healthy microbiome. So the obvious example is going to be the processed foods. We all know those lack a healthy microbiome just because of the way that they are so highly processed and, heat treated and whatnot. There's some not obvious examples as well. So for instance, the produce section, what you'll notice as you start digging into like what's food is much of the produce is so first scrubbed, right? So you're scrubbing off some of the good microbes. It had microbes when they were growing, you scrub some of it off and then they wax it in order to ship it for long distances, sometimes 1,500 miles or more. And what the problem is when they wax it, not only does that kill microbes on it, but oftentimes that also contains not only GRAS chemicals, but fungicides. which also kills off the good microbes that you need. And when you consume that, it's also going to be killing off some of your microbes in your gastrointestinal tract. Then you move over to the meat counter, right? And what you'll find is that, say chicken, for instance, it's a federal law that chicken has to be sterilized when it is sold in a grocery store. So for instance, most chicken sold in a grocery store is dipped in chlorine. And if it's now that people have figured that out, that it's dipped in chlorine, which obviously kills the microbes, and there's chlorine residues that contain itself in that chicken that you eat, which then kills off your microbe. But once people found that out, some people pushed back that they didn't want to have their chicken dipped in chlorine. So then some of these companies, some organic companies, for instance, have switched to other things like hydrogen peroxide and vinegar derived from corn, but they can't tell you how much of the corn protein actually gets into the meat. And so if you're somebody with, for instance, gluten sensitivity, which is rampant, at least 30% of people in this country have that, then it's not healthy for you to eat that chicken, not only because it's sterilized, does not help build your microbiome, but you're getting a dose of glutens in the form of that corn. Eggs are the same way. Eggs are typically considered dirty by the federal government. And so it's mandated that they're sterilized when they're sold in the grocery store. So eggs are often dipped in chlorine as well. To sterilize the shell. The problem is the shell is porous, and the government recognizes that it is porous and that some of that chlorine actually gets into the egg itself. And so what the FDA did was they decided to declare that chlorine as a food additive. So they recognize that it is porous and it is getting into your egg, but it's a food additive and it doesn't have to be included on the label. And of course, when you eat that, it is not only has it now destroyed any kind of healthy microbiome that egg may have contained, outside and inside, but it also breaks down your microbiome, sterilizing your own microbiome in your gastrointestinal tract, which sets you up for disease. So in essence, what I have learned is that in order to maintain health, in order to particularly reverse a disease, you have to develop a relationship with your soil, right? Because the soil, and we have many, many scientific studies documenting this, that your health is directly related to the soil health. And when you kill off microbes in the soil and you're eating the food that comes from that soil, we have studies that show that you now have less diversity in your own gastrointestinal tract and less numbers. And we already know, also through studies, that the lower diversity of microbes you have in your gastrointestinal tract, the more susceptible you are to disease. And so we've actually been able to use like PCR testing to fingerprint somebody's microbiome that has different diseases, all kinds of autoimmune diseases. And then they've been given fecal transplants to replenish those microbes, and the diseases have reversed. Even hair loss has been reversed by doing fecal transplants to replenish their microbiomes. So most of us don't want to do a fecal transplant, right? So what I do is every day, my family and I, we make choices that are food choices, water choices, emotional choices, relationship choices that are specifically designed to build a robust microbiome. And I'll close by saying we actually know that the soil microbes, soil and root microbes, work together with the human microbes to actually create a natural immunity in humans. And this is one reason why we're getting sicker, is because we're allowing the soils to get sicker, to lose this microbial diversity, and it is directly affecting our human health.
Yeah, we could probably spend a whole day talking about just this.
It's fascinating.
Well, it is, and it is all related. Plants are full of microbes, or they should be. It's interesting. My dear departed mother grew up in the plains of North Dakota. I grew up on a farm. She said a person needs to eat a peck of dirt before they die. And I study soil microbiology now, and I somehow think back, and I think my mom was a pretty good microbiologist. In other words, relating exactly to what you're talking about, that we got to go out and get dirty, and healthy soil, isn't dirty. It actually is part of a healthy ecosystem. So
yeah, and ancient cultures used to eat dirt.
Yeah, well, there actually are some dirt eaters still around the world.
Yeah, we eat dirt at certain times too. When we're sick, you know, in certain capacities, we make a toothpaste out of it as well. We make it a point to go out with our children and visit our local farmers. You know, we like Joel Salatin's down the street from us, so we go to his farm. We're local regenerative farmers, I should mention, not
Right.
you know, conventionally trained farmers. So we go down and we play in the soil, and because it's not only important to eat those microbes, it's important to breathe them in. So we play with it, you know, throw it up in the air, whatever you want to do, rub it on your skin. We breathe it in through, so it goes in through, you know, the mucous membranes and whatnot to repopulate all of that.
All right. So, like I said, we could really get off on a tangent there. Yes. So I want to circle back around, and I apologize, but Nihal Ozen had a question on carbon measurement that I want Megan to address. But I also want to bring this back to soil carbon. Megan, you know, if you could talk about the methodologies and the complexities, because that's actually a very large point of debate these days as to, look, you say you put a ton of carbon in the soil, did you? And what kind of variability? And it's a tremendous economic and resource burden. You know, right now at Locus, we do all the soil carbon measurements for our growers, and if you include the subsamples on, say, like 1,000 acres, we might have to be taking 600 to 700 samples, and we pay for all that. But you know, ultimately, if we're going to be able to do this accurately, or you know, do this across tens, if not hundreds of millions of acres, it's got to be less complex. But again, I want to come back to also, as you address this, once you're done with that part of it, have you comment too on the importance of soil carbon to microbial soil health, because actually all soil carbon is microbial residue. It's you don't get healthy soils without a lot of soil or carbon accumulation. But anyway,
Right.
I'm drifting myself. So could you talk, Megan, about analytical methods and what's going on there, and where do you see us being in 4 or 5 years, if not sooner?
Yeah. This is a huge standing question. How are we going to, or how can we monitor, verify soil carbon sequestration cost effectively and while maintaining accuracy? And so there's different protocols for measuring soil organic carbon. One, you can think of something that I do. I go out into the field with a soil core and pound it into the ground and pull it out, and then we take the soil back to the lab. We have to sieve it, we have to pick out the roots, we have to pick out the litter, so that we can understand just what is exactly the soil carbon, and not just roots, and so roots will not contribute to the soil carbon stocks that we measure. We define soil as something that passes through a 2 millimeter sieve. Anyway, I'm telling you all of this because the process of actually collecting soil samples is one thing, but to follow through with the analysis, it's very time consuming, and it requires instrumentation that is expensive. And so there's the physical soil sampling aspect and the quantification back in the lab with an elemental analyzer. And then there's also an alternative approach using modeling, either process-based biogeochemical models or some sort of emission factors to determine the soil carbon sequestration or the amount of soil carbon that has been sequestered. Then there's also hybrid approaches that use the soil sampling approaches and the modeling, and sometimes paired with also satellite imagery. And so definitely the models models would be much cheaper, right? Because that prevents us from having to go out and sample, multiple locations on a field, take it back to the lab, process it, and analyze it, which is very costly. But models at this point cannot accurately capture soil organic carbon change at the field level. So if you're interested in what's going on your farm, a model might not get you there. So models perform better in some places, compared to others. And so there's a lot of, we're not quite there yet to say that models will work everywhere all the time. And so that comes back to how do we accurately quantify and measure, verify how much carbon we have sequestered. And so, with time and with I think the most important part is being able to, we have a lot of data out there. And so in order to accelerate the use of models in accurately capturing or quantifying soil organic carbon change over time, we have to feed that data that exists, that we've actually sampled soils and measured soil carbon stocks back in the lab. We have to feed that and combine that with our modeling approaches. And, because there's so much data that exists out there, really, there's a huge need for the synthesis and the integration of this data in a consistent way. And we're working towards that. I think we're getting there, but we can do a lot better. But also there's technological advancements that are occurring, and I have high hopes for spectroscopy. Spectroscopy would present an alternative way to quantify soil carbon stocks, as opposed to taking it back into the lab and using a dry combustion method with the expensive instrument that I talked about. So spectroscopy literally uses like light reflectance. And so, and to quantify how much carbon is there. So we're getting there, but essentially that would save time, it would reduce costs, and it would allow us to scale quantification in a way that we cannot do now. And so spectroscopy would, you would take a soil sample, even you can potentially even do this in the field, but scan it. And so within a minute, you have, theoretically, you'd be able to quantify soil carbon. So the technological development, so that is something that is well on its way, and hopefully we can get there sooner rather than later, because this would open up a lot of opportunities and reduce the costs and the time for quantifying soil carbon.
Right. Thank you, Megan. There are lots of comments being made here, and there are some good places, to go look for things like the EDF report that's being mentioned, but also
Right.
ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, has let 3 grants to people, such as the Soil Health Institute in North Carolina, which is a good place to go to look for information. We'll put some of this on the links and websites as well for this.
Yeah.
And the 3 projects that are being funded by them, I think, will make some real advances. And they're mostly based on spectroscopy.
Yes.
In terms of what's going on. So
Yeah.
maybe, Megan, you could also guide us after this in terms of where to go look for more information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a comment in the chat, and I think this is a very important point, is that, these protocols, there's no standard protocol. There's no gold, standard at this point. But I think it's extremely critical that we have some guidance, some standardization across these different protocols, so that they're relatable and they're reliable, and that we can assure that what we are measuring is has been accurately quantified, and so that the amount of carbon that we are sequestering is indeed, we're confident with those numbers. But it is true that there is not one gold standard, but that is definitely something that I think is absolutely necessary as we move so quickly in this space.
Right. Well, there are groups working on this as well. One certainly is the Soil Carbon Solutions Center at Colorado State University that people can go to. We should put the link to that on here. Also, there is a group funded by the USDA called Open Team, which is a remarkable group of individuals and companies that are working to standardize and compare best methods. So we'll put a link to that as well. It is complex, but people are making progress.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So Will and Jenni, you're kind of the pragmatic end result of the two ends of what we're talking about here. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'll use my mom again. I grew up on a farm. You know, she used to go out in our fields and she'd take a spade and dig it up and she'd smell it. She'd say, this smells good or this smells bad. We got to do something different or not. You know, we're talking about the technical aspects of measuring soil carbon, which is a big deal this day. And soil carbon is an important part of all this because it's representative of the microbial communities. But what do you do on your farm? What do you physically do when you go out and look at your land? What do you look for? How do you determine whether your soil health is improving or decreasing?
So I appreciate all that Megan said. That was very interesting. I need to know more about it. We are not in any way experts in measuring carbon. We're experts in building carbon.
Right.
It's two very different things. To answer your question, I can in my office, I've got 2 glass jars of soil. One came from my side of the fence that has been managed holistically with a lot of animal impact for 25 years. The other right across the fence is my cousin's farm. It's been farmed very industrially, monocrop, corn, cotton, peanuts, in rotation, a lot of chemical fertilizer, a lot of pesticides, a lot of tillage. And the 2 jars of dirt look like they came from different planets. They're different color. Mine's very dark, his is red, mine's very organic, spongy, his is very mineral. It's just like it's two different planets. So that's long term to look at it after the fact. Did what I do work? Yes, it did. The ongoing would be probably watching the plant varieties successionally when we first take on a piece of land that's been farmed, degraded through industrial farming. Certain plants will come up, usually taprooted annuals the first year, and watching those plant species change as the less opportunistic annuals give way to the perennials when animal impact really starts paying off. What we do, we call prescriptive grazing. We've got a lot of different species of animals here on the farm, and we find that different growing situations in the field call for different animal impacts. Sometimes it seems to me the land's crying out to have hogs on it, and sometimes it's goats or what's necessary next. Sometimes you need nitrogen, so we put broiler chickens on it, cattle, sheep, down the line. It's a process.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're a soil whisperer in terms of trying to get the sense for.
Soil whisperer is a little flattering, but I'll say that to the first thing that I think that manager of land must do is understand his ecosystem. I wouldn't have a clue how to farm Brigade Brown farms in North Dakota. My ecosystem is so different, but the fundamentals are the same. The impact that the cows and the hogs and the chickens and the goats have is the same. So you understand your ecosystem, which is very site specific. Then you understand the impact that various procedures have, like the animal impact, and you make the prescription to attain the context that you desire. In our case, what we desire and what we want is a savanna, a white oak pastures savanna. That is the ecosystem that developed here through the millennia. And land is predisposed to return to the ecosystem that it evolved from or into before we took technology and changed it. So we help the land get back to where it wants to be.
Well, that's a remarkable story. I have a follow-up question, but I want to go to Sina for a minute. So Sina, we're talking about some wonderful things in terms of science, as well as in terms of just Will and Jenni understanding their land and being able to read that land. But there's a big disconnect, I think, between most people outside of the Regenerative Agricultural Committee, we'll say, just to put some borders around it, and somebody who walks into their Safeway or whatever grocery store they shop at, or walking into McDonald's and understanding where that food came from, and understanding that they could improve their food by the purchasing decisions they make. What's your view on how we can better communicate with people? How do we get people to care, to understand that the food they eat is important to them, and that more importantly, that they have a lot of economic power. Every time they buy something, they're making a vote on terms of how people do things.
Yeah, I love that question because, well, it's complex, but that's exactly how I view the food supply is, I approach it with, I don't want more government coming in to make more laws that are going to have more loopholes and such. I want a free market solution. So that's what I try to do, is educate and encourage people to vote with their dollars. And it has been challenging, but I understand the mindset of the consumer because I was there not too long ago, right? So now I've written 2 books that I've tried to write them to reach the consumer. So what I've tried to do is take the science and put it in a way that's relatable to a consumer. And I think that's key. To reach a consumer, you kind of have to put yourself in the mindset, right? So before I got sick, I didn't pay much attention either to the food, right? And this should be kind of shocking to most people because my PhD was nutrition. So you would think of all people, I would be paying attention and like reading all the labels and such. But I was reading, if I ever read a label, it was usually like calorie content or fat content, right? Because I was trained that fat's bad, like we all are, from the food guide pyramid to now my plate. So I was looking for the wrong things on the labels and I didn't really understand how to read them. And for me, oftentimes it was the price mattered for the food. It really took getting sick for me to wake up and start making different changes, right? Different choices. And what I have found is that's consistent among most buyers. Moms are usually the ones that buy food. They buy roughly 80% of the food for the family, right? So right then and there, it tells you need to target the mother. For me, this has kind of, they have found me, let's say. So I didn't intentionally go out and try to target a certain audience to try to change their mind. What happened was my message resonated with a lot of people, especially mothers, because either they're sick, their husbands are sick, or their kids are sick. Now over half of all kids are on the autoimmune continuum. So these people are resonating with my message and finding me. These are the people that are the target audience, because these are the ones that already realize that there's something wrong with the food. They may not know what it is, just like I did not initially know what it is, but they have that intuition and their body is telling them something's wrong with the food and they're ready to make changes because they're already sick. If you're sitting there trying to market to people who are not sick, this is what I have found. If you market based on like under the guise of like climate change, right? And climate change is a serious issue that we need to address, right? I'm right there alongside you. But what I have found is that it is a very political issue. And so if I started talking to somebody about, oh, you should eat better to help the climate, anything related to that, half of them tune me out right away, right? And you do have a few people that will either already understand the issue and they'll pay more for the food, or you have those people that are like, oh, I do want to help the climate, so I'm going to pay for that food. But the majority of the people are probably going to tune you out because it has become so political. So what I have done is indirectly help with climate change by focusing my attention on the people who are already sick. So this is how I view it. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, people first have to have food and water and shelter, right? Before they go to the next level, before they think outside of themselves. First, they have to secure their own safety. This is an evolutionary concept for, you know, how humans have survived. Well, most people nowadays, and especially in America, we are sick. We are somewhere on this autoimmune continuum. And what that means is that you're in a state of survival, right? You're not sitting there thinking, oh, what should I do to help the environment or to save the planet? You are trying to save yourself or your child or help your husband or your wife, right? It's estimated that we're spending 70% of our day in fight or flight, right? That's the average person in America spends 70% of the day in fight or flight. You're not going to be able to rationalize or logic your way through an argument with somebody who is in fight or flight. And I know that because I was there when I was sick, right? You can't access that part of your brain because you're in survival mode. So what I do is I've learned to meet the people where they are, right? They're in fight or flight. And so you address the health benefits, right? How purchasing this regeneratively grown food is going to help you, your husband, and your children. You know, it's going to help save your health. Then once you get them out of fight or flight and they've saved themselves, right, they're healing, then they can start looking outside of themselves. And that's that. Yes, there's freeze too. I just saw somebody said that in a comment. There's fight, flight, or freeze. So we shorten it by saying fight or flight. So you have to get somebody out of that, or they have to get themselves out of fight or flight first in order to then think of something beyond themselves, right? And that is just the way that the human mind is built. It's just an evolutionary adaptation. So I target the health aspect of regenerative ag.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think ultimately, this is my own opinion. We have got to do a better job of interacting with people beyond the farm gate. A lot of times we end up talking to each other. We've got to help people understand. And I think certainly coming from a family that has a lot of autoimmune issues, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of that. But you know, also I care about climate change as well. So after a while, I think people just get overloaded, right? It's a sense of hopelessness that, oh my God, there's nothing I can do. And we have to get them out of that cycle.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I was thinking about this, how can you actually reach more consumers? So they find me, the ones that are sick, they just find me, you know, and then I help them move that way. And they realize they need to eat this food that has the healthy microbiome. And then that solves the problem itself. But another way you can do it is, you know, based on the pharmaceutical model, you know, without that intention. So let me explain. You know, pharmaceutical companies, they go in and they have these reps that solicit the medical doctors, and you know, they in other words, like buy them off, right? Just to promote their pharmaceutical product. Well, you could use a similar model without the whole, you know, buying them off and whatever, by going in and like kind of like partnering with these alternative medicine practitioners, let's say. And you can have like a one-page summary. So you're not overwhelming them with information, but a one-page summary that's, you know, scientific documentation, study after study of how human health is related to the microbiome. So you give them that one-page study, you give them a pamphlet that they can hand to their patient that briefly explains this and the impact of, you know, regenerative ag on their health and how they can take charge of their health and heal by making this shift. And then you provide them with farms that these patients can go and get their food from, either local farms or like Will's farm. He sells food online now. You don't have to live in Georgia. You can buy his food, you know, across the United States. So you give it to them so that they have the information, and it makes it easy. It makes it convenient from them. It has a trust factor in it because this healthcare practitioner is somebody that the patient trusts, right? So there you've built trust in the food supply because they're recommending this. And like I said, you've made it convenient for them. It's like, instead of the doctor just writing a prescription for a medication, I did it as they're also writing this prescription for their local farmer for this local regenerative
Right.
farmer to help them build their healthy microbiome.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So Jenni, you had your hand raised, and I know you do the marketing for your farm. So you must have some wisdom to share with us here as well.
Did, but I whispered it to Will, so I'm gonna let him say it.
Yeah. Okay.
She does the thinking. I'm just a pretty face.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah.
I did want to comment on when Sina was talking about the cost side of it. We have a comment we'd like to make about that. As farmers who have been managing our land differently for the last 25 years, I'd like to call attention to the fact that we internalize so many of the costs that are externalized by the commodity centralized system that our cost of production goes up. You know, for instance, the hardest thing I ever gave up was nitrogen fertilizer. It's like getting off of drugs for me. And when I did that, I ceased to contribute to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. But that didn't change the fact that when the shopper, the mother, as Sina pointed out, goes to buy my products in the grocery store or online, it's more expensive. And often we're asked, what you do is great. We appreciate the impact on the environment, the animals, the rural town, but what can you do to get it to the people that can't afford it? And that's a real conundrum for me. You know, it's just like trying to solve two of the most complex problems we've got: fixing the broken food system and economic disparity. And I think we've done a pretty good job on the food system, but I don't know where to start with economic disparity. That's out of my wheelhouse. And one of the things that we're looking at with some folks right now is to separate the cost of the food from the value of the ecological services that we provide. And that way, a vegetarian that you know, made the lifestyle choice to not eat meat could like what we're doing with carbon sequestration and buy that separately. So there's several ideas floating around. It's not time to talk about them. I just wanted to float it out there because I think
we could have a whole new conversation, and you'll see that a good friend of mine, Aldian Donnelly, is making a whole bunch of comments here. And Aldian, I'm not inviting you to talk because he'll really take us in different directions. But she's a real expert on some of this. And what you're talking about is democratizing food for people, healthy food for people. And one aspect, I think, of carbon markets, even though we decided not to focus on those too much today, is that to provide any grower, not just you, with additional on-farm income from providing those ecological services, such that, who knows, maybe that's a way of you being able to then pass that ecological service value that you get back to the consumer in the form of less expensive food, because all of a sudden now, you know, you're able to offer that in terms of the overall income from your farm. It's worth a almost a separate discussion, Abbey. We should think about that in our next webinar. It's very important. So, Megan, you have roots in Georgia, and I said early on that you've written some remarkable papers, one of which was taking degraded peanut land, if I remember correctly, converting it to pasture land and measuring the amount of carbon that was accumulated on a per year basis over, I think it was about 4.5 to 5 years. And I was stunned by how quickly you were able to see those changes. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So my roots begin in Nebraska.
Okay.
So I have to say that, or else my parents would probably be angry if I claimed Georgia. But I did go to graduate school in Georgia, but my life began and I grew up in the cornfields.
Well, go Huskers. So, that's right. Yeah. Big
yeah.
Red. Yeah.
So that was such an interesting study. And actually, so during my PhD at the Odom School of Ecology, I actually took this on as a side project. I was working in forests at the time, focused on carbon and how, you know, climate change would influence our carbon sequestration or loss in forests and trying to quantify that. But then I was really intrigued by this project on dairy farms that they were utilizing rotational grazing practices. And I was asked to come in on the project as an ecologist because they needed someone to think, to pull it all together. And this project was really what got me super excited about agriculture. and I've since, really taken the deep dive and focus on soil carbon sequestration, soil health, and agriculture from then on. So this really inspired me. And so this study that Paul's referring to, again, was on dairy farms that were utilizing rotational grazing practices. And in the South, on these particular fields, and it's very common that, peanut farms or cotton farms have degraded soils just due to the management over multiple years. They've lost a lot of their topsoil, and so they have low, poor soil health, and that comes along with that low carbon concentrations. So we're really starting at the at the beginning almost, right? Because they're so depleted. And so then the farmers that came in, utilized these farms to then start growing grass and bring cattle and rotate them frequently and maximize the productivity, and really had it dialed in, understanding the intricacies of, nutrient cycling and maximizing productivity while utilizing the cow to, to really, maintain that productivity in a way that, they're able to feed on that grass year round. So what we saw, the crux of the story is that these practices lead to substantial increase in a fast rate, actually, of soil carbon sequestration. So they are able to rebuild their carbon stocks quite quickly, but also substantially. So the magnitude was a lot. And so that really, that was I was very surprised by that finding. And that's what really inspired me to dig deeper. Like, why is this happening? Where does it happen? How fast can it happen? How, where can we deploy these practices and other practices like that? Or, whether it involves cattle or not, but how can we start to manage our lands to, enhance the amount of soil carbon that's sequestered, so serving as a short-term climate change mitigation strategy, but at the same time, and probably more importantly, enhancing soil health so that we can reduce the inputs of fertilizer, so that we can reduce the amount of water that we're putting on the land. And so this, this was something that really inspired me to continue along this research. And so again, why, will we see this everywhere? Likely not, because, it's so dependent, context dependent, and management ultimately is adaptive. Regenerative practices, you have to make a lot of decisions on your feet. And so it's really hard to exactly replicate this particular management everywhere. But we know that the potential is there, and that, in this case in Georgia, and several studies since then have shown that with grazing management, you're really able to maximize or tap into that potential and rebuild soil health and rebuild carbon at quite successfully.
Well, yeah, no, and I would agree. And, as Will said, he wouldn't know how to farm Gabe Brown's land in North Dakota. People say all politics are local. Well, all regenerative farming is probably local as well. Those types of things. But, the importance of range and pasture land is there's 600 million acres of range and pasture land in the United States, 400 million acres of cropland, and we ought to be applying this to everything. But certainly, we have got to pay attention to what's going on in range and pasture land.
Right.
Um,
Agreed.
so, Sina, I got a question for you. Neil and a couple of others have talked about here in terms of QR codes on food. There are labels being developed. Certainly, you have organic labels. You now have regenerative organic labels that are being developed. I belong to a group called the Alternative Fuels and Chemicals Coalition, which also deals with food. We're working with the ASTM on a carbon intensity label for consumer goods, not just food, but packaging and all kinds of things. What's your view, Sina, on having something that people could actually see or scan, or on the other hand, people talk about label fatigue, that after a while it just all disappears. Could you give us a comment on that whole topic?
Sure. This was actually the focus of the second book I wrote with, I co-wrote it with Joel Salatin. The book is actually called Beyond Labels because.
Okay, I should have read it first.
Yeah, because that's one of those things. I mean, that's perfect that you asked me this question, right? Both Joel and I are of the same mindset that we need to move beyond labels, right? And that means different things to different people. To me, this is how I view it. Most people shop in the grocery store, all right? So we are kind of dependent on these labels. And the more you learn about the loopholes and the deception behind the labels, the more you realize we're slaves to these labels and they're leading us down a path of unwellness. But regardless, most of us will continue to shop in the grocery store to some extent. Even Joel admits that he buys like organic bananas and things. So he does also rely on the label. So do I. So having said that, there is label fatigue, right? There's just information all over these packages. And again, I will say, you've got to put yourself in the mind of the consumer. It's usually the busy mom who's in the grocery store, and oftentimes she's got her kids with her, like me, who are like trying to grab stuff off the shelves and everything. And Abby's shaking her head yes. We're trying to move through the aisles as quickly as possible so they're not, grabbing something glass and breaking that on the ground, right? So you're pretty much a creature of habit when you're grabbing things that and you try to get out, right? And there's really, not only is there a time issue of reading everything on that label, then there's the trying to understand what's on that label. There's already a lot of confusion about the current labels that we have. There's even confusion over the organic label, which has been in there for a long time. Like when you actually ask somebody, what does the organic label mean? They don't get the answer correct. And again, we have loopholes with that one, with hydroponics and, pigs being able to be raised on a slab of concrete that you can call it organic and, all these loopholes. So I do think there's too many labels. And I do think as more and more come out and clutter the packages more, it will add to the confusion of it. And I think because people already don't understand the current labeling system, just like I didn't understand it, they're not going to be that interested in a new label, right? They're already not taking the time that is required to really understand the current labels on the packaging. So I feel like it's just going to be one more thing that's just one more like seal that's just stuck on there. And again, you'll have people who are really into saving the planet and climate change. They're like, okay, there's the label that came out. I'm going to look for that label. But the majority of the moms that are in the grocery store are probably not going to be like, okay, now, I'm sitting here, I'm trying to make like we're month to month trying to pay our bills. My kid has now developed a learning disability. This other one has asthma. I'm chronically fatigued. They're not going to put it as a priority to look for a label that's going to help the planet, right? And that's not a judgment of whether or not they should look for that label. That's regardless. They're going to be looking for, how can I put food on the table? How can I help my child, to not have this learning disability? They have other things that they're thinking about. And one more label is going to just add to the confusion. And we don't trust labels. Like, as we're learning more labels, we don't trust them. You know, I mean, and people, like I said, you already have about half the country that doesn't even believe in climate change or think it's an issue and they think it's political. So how are you going to convince that person with a label that now you should buy that food that has that label on it? So I just think there's a lot of money that goes into labels, right? Creating a solid label, you know, and then making sure somebody abides by the label, you know, approving them for the label, putting the label on there, the printing costs and everything, design costs. There's a lot to go into it. And I'm just not sure that the return is going to be there on a label.
Yeah, no, those are good points. And obviously all messaging and things like that needs to be personalized. People have to have a motivation to want to care, but that trust comes into that as well. Like you say, a lot of people, even science isn't trusted anymore, right? So,
that's right.
So Abbey, here's another whole webinar.
Yes, and I'm a scientist, and I tell people don't trust scientists. Like, you know, we are all fallible. We're all human, and so you know, as Megan knows, there's a lot of cherry picking and, you know, skewed statistical analysis in scientific literature. You have to be very careful about it. So I would think that, and this is just my opinion, you know, one person, as a mom who was sick and just been through it, if you want to kind of build trust in this kind of like carbon credit system, you may consider something, instead of like putting all this money and effort into labels, you might consider something like blockchain, because that's an open ledger where everybody can see it. And actually, like just last week, I think they started selling carbon offsets on blockchain. This could increase trust in the system because it's an open ledger that you can actually see. Obviously, blockchain opens a huge can of worms, you know, but I'm just saying, if you're looking for places to gain trust, because even when people are going to like donate, you know, like when you donate to a company and they're like, oh, we'll plant a tree for you. A lot of us don't trust that anymore.
Well, right. No, the greenwashing. And you know, you and I should get on the phone, and you can also take a look at the recording of our second webinar series. We've talked about blockchain.
Oh,
Blockchain is becoming a very important part of several people's efforts on this. We're doing it at Locus. We had people from Amazon Web Services talk about the blockchain system they're doing. So you're absolutely right. And of course, people have to understand what blockchain is. And so that, in order to have that trust, I think trust is a very important thing, but it's based upon knowledge. You can't understand what, you know, or you can't use what you don't understand, and you can't love what you don't understand. And a lot of what you're talking about, maybe this sounds a little corny. Keep in mind, I'm from California. You know, people embrace what they love, and they can only love what they understand. And we love our kids, even though we don't understand them. So there's a little bit of a paradox there sometimes, but we somehow have to combine all those things together so people do have some trust in what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I completely agree. I was born and raised in California too, actually. And as far as the love component, I'll just be quick because I know this is off topic in a way, but the root cause of all disease is inability to love yourself.
Well, right.
So I completely agree with you.
So Jenni, we're talking about marketing and reaching out to consumers. You are the head of marketing for one of the most progressive regenerative farms in the United States. What do you do to communicate with people, and how have they responded?
So marketing is just a code word for education. We have found that you know, the customers that we attract are you know, have been led to believe that they can't trust themselves. They need an expert. They need help making decisions that are you know, very, very basic. And so we've really had a lot of fun with it through 2021. 2020 was a tough year for all of us in food production, but we really started working hard, drilling down on the cycles of nature, which has been you know, which has been great. It's interesting that some of our most informative posts are some of the ones that catch the least amount of traction. And it's because there's just, it's showing that there's an incredible amount of work there left to be done. You know, we had a call earlier this week, or actually today, about lactic acid and how we use that in processing. And so what is really heartening is to see consumers reaching out with those types of questions. We have a great customer service staff that goes through training every Wednesday to get more information on these types of questions. But y'all all hit around it. You know, certifications are great when they're great, and they're bad when they're bad. And I know that that's a real boiled down version, but you know, what started out as the local food movement should really have been called the Know Your Farmer movement. Just as Sina has a relationship with Joel Salatin, and if she's got a question about the way something's produced, she goes and she asks Joel. We have those same consumers that say, you know, what about you know, the way you graze? And we might not have the answer that we want, but we give them the answer that's true. And that they're able to then make the decisions that are right for them. So you know, the real pleasure for us in doing this is making that final connection with the end consumer. You know, we built cabins on the farm so that customers could come and experience the food production system themselves. And that's been really rewarding.
Yeah, no, that would be. We have to reconnect people with their food supply and the land in which it's grown. We've got about 10 minutes left. Megan, do you want to make any final comments here?
I want to come stay on the farm.
Yeah, right.
You need to. Of all the people, how do we not know each other?
I know it. I guess
After this we will.
Yes. I'll see you next week. No, but I mean, I guess building off of that, I find that working with producers and ranchers it's been extremely eye-opening for me, and I think it's extremely important because I talk about all of these nerdy, you know, how to measure soil carbon and quantify it accurately. That's the scientist in me, but recognizing I've increasingly recognized that in order for my data or for my science to be meaningful, I need to be working with people like Will and Jenni, and to make sure that we're constantly communicating, learning from one another, because if we're going to make any change, we're going to do it together. And so I guess I guess I'm building off my comment about staying in the cabin, but truly, I just want to make sure too that my detailed reductionist mindset doesn't get lost in what's really important.
Yeah, that's great. So Sina, any finishing comments for you?
I want to say thank you for having me on. I love savory, and Abbey's fantastic, and now I love you, Paul, and and Megan, and I already knew the Harrises. They're always fantastic. So I'm just happy to be part of the community and to contribute in any way I can. And if anybody, I'm realizing how important it is to build community, to help each other, to support each other, because this can be a lonely path. So, if people want to connect or whatever, I'm happy, just reach out to me. I'm all about supporting farmers. So anything I can do to help, please keep me in mind. And yeah, just, if I can be of any other assistance, just at any other time, feel free to call on me and I'll be there.
Well, I'm very anxious to read your books. I mean, the power of the pen is very great. And I hope you sell lots of books and people read them. So Will and Jenni, any final comments from your end?
Megan, what time next week can you be here?
Anytime.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure to be on y'all. I felt like I was out of my class a little bit with these heavy hitters, but thank you for having me, and y'all come see us.
All right. Well, thank you. So Abbey and Olivia, any comments you would like to make?
I just want to say thank you for everyone for joining. I think, Paul, like you said, the conversation just keeps going. We find, we talk about one topic, how we're going to go deep on that, and then it surfaces 3 or 4 more that we need to dig into. So I hope that everyone sees this as an ongoing conversation. This is by no means the beginning or the end, but that we all need to be in this together and keep this conversation going.
All right, great. We had several questions that I think we addressed some of them, but again, my friend Alden Donnelly addressed a lot of them. And Alden, I would say Alden is a remarkable source of knowledge and understanding in the space of carbon markets. To the extent that she would be willing to further answer questions, I'll check with her and then we'll let people know. But I appreciate, Alden, you're taking the time to, in the background here, answer some questions for us on things that were important to people. It's much appreciated. We're building quite a community along all here, and it's a pleasure to meet everybody, a whole bunch of new friends. And one of my favorite quotes is, never doubt that a small, dedicated group of people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And I sense we have not necessarily even a small group of people. We certainly have a group of dedicated people, and I'm very appreciative of all the work you all do to make this world a better place. So thank you, everybody. And we'll close up shop now, and we'll think about another webinar here before too long.
That's right. Yes. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for hosting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jenni and Will and Sina and Megan. It was amazing. Thanks for everyone for attending. The next steps from here is that Olivia and I will get this recording all polished up and sent out to you in an email, along with the links that were mentioned by Megan, and any other links that this panelists want to have sent out. We'll also include their contact information and ours, so that you can reach out to them and to us, and we'll keep this conversation going. So I think we'll wrap with that. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Cheers. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.